The road was quiet that afternoon, the kind of stillness that comes after a long day of rain. The air smelled like wet earth, and small puddles shimmered along the side of the two-lane highway. A young woman named Claire was driving home after finishing a double shift at the local hospital. Her eyes felt heavy, and the soft hum of her old car almost made her want to close them for a moment, but she forced herself to stay alert. She just wanted to reach home, take a shower, and rest. Claire had been a nurse for 4 years. She had seen all kinds of things: pain, joy, loss, and miracles. But that day felt unusually quiet, almost too peaceful. She turned up the radio a little, hoping some soft music would keep her awake. The clock on the dashboard showed it was a little past 4 in the afternoon. She had about 30 more minutes to reach home. As she drove around a curve, she noticed something strange ahead, a thick cloud of smoke rising in the distance. At first, she thought someone was burning leaves near the roadside, but then she saw the faint reflection of flashing lights through the smoke. Her stomach tightened. She slowed down and pulled her car to the side, her heartbeat growing faster with each passing second. When she got closer, she saw it clearly. A black SUV had crashed into a tree. The front part was crushed and flames were spreading from under the hood. The air smelled like gasoline and burning rubber. For a moment, Claire froze. Her hands trembled slightly on the steering wheel. She looked around, hoping someone else had already stopped to help, but the road was empty. There was no time to think. She jumped out of her car and ran toward the wreck. The heat from the fire hit her face as she got closer. She could hear the sound of crackling flames and something else, a faint cry. She ran faster. When she reached the car, she peered inside and saw a small child strapped into a car seat in the back. The child couldn't have been more than 2 years old, crying and kicking helplessly. The smoke was thick inside, and Claire could barely see through the shattered glass. There was no one else in sight. Whoever had been driving was gone, or maybe thrown out. Her heart pounded harder. The fire was spreading fast, and she knew there were only seconds before the car would be engulfed completely. She tried to open the back door, but it was jammed. She yanked at the handle again and again, but it didn't move. The heat was unbearable now. Sweat ran down her neck, and the smoke made her cough. She looked around desperately for something, anything to break the glass. She spotted a medium-sized rock near the side of the road, picked it up with shaking hands, and smashed it against the rear window. The first hit cracked the glass but didn't break it. She hit again, harder this time, and the window shattered. The sound of breaking glass made the child scream louder, but it gave Claire the strength to keep going. She reached through the broken window, careful to avoid the sharp edges. Her arms got scratched and she could feel blood trickling down her forearm, but she didn't care. The only thing she could think about was getting that child out. The seatbelt latch was stuck. Her fingers slipped again and again as she tried to unbuckle it. The smoke was thicker now and she could barely breathe. Her eyes watered from the heat. She took a deep breath, coughed, and tried once more. This time the buckle released. She pulled the child toward her and crawled backward out of the car, holding the little one close against her chest. Just as she stepped a few feet away, there was a loud pop from the engine, followed by a burst of flames. Claire turned her body to shield the child from the heat. She stumbled back, gasping, and finally collapsed onto the grass beside the road. The child was coughing but alive. Claire wrapped her arms around the trembling little body and whispered, "It's okay. You're safe now. You're safe." For a moment, everything was quiet again except for the sound of fire burning behind them. Claire's hands were shaking, her heart pounding so loud she could hear it in her ears. The adrenaline was fading, and exhaustion started to take over. She looked down at the child, whose face was dirty with smoke but whose big eyes were still open, searching for comfort. Claire brushed a strand of hair away from the child's forehead and smiled weakly. A few cars began to stop. Someone shouted, "Is anyone hurt?" A man ran toward her with his phone in his hand, saying he had called emergency services. Claire could barely speak, but she nodded and said, "There's only the baby. No one else in the car." She glanced at the burning SUV and felt a chill. If she had arrived even 1 minute later, the child would not have survived. Within minutes, sirens filled the air. Fire trucks and ambulances arrived, their lights cutting through the thick smoke. Paramedics rushed toward her, gently taking the child from her arms. One of them, a woman around Claire's age, looked at her and said, "You saved this baby's life." Claire just shook her head. "I was just here," she murmured, still catching her breath. They insisted on checking her too, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders and cleaning the cuts on her hands. She sat on the side of the road, watching as firefighters battled the flames. The SUV was completely destroyed now, nothing but twisted metal. The paramedic brought the toddler back after checking for injuries. "He's going to be okay," she said softly. Claire smiled through tired eyes. When the police came to ask questions, she explained everything: how she had seen the smoke, stopped her car, and pulled the child out. The officer nodded and took notes, clearly amazed. "You're lucky to be alive," he said quietly. Claire didn't feel lucky, though. She just felt grateful that the child had survived. A few minutes later, an older firefighter approached her. "You did something very brave," he told her. "Most people wouldn't have gone near that car." Claire gave a small shrug. "I didn't really think," she said. "I just saw the baby and I couldn't walk away." As the chaos around her slowly settled, she finally had time to breathe. The child was now sitting in a paramedic's arms, wrapped in a white blanket, looking calmer. Claire wondered who the parents were. She imagined what they must be feeling at that moment, not knowing what had happened. A part of her hoped they'd soon arrive so she could hand their child back safely. After almost an hour, an officer came to tell her that the car was registered to a well-known businessman in the city. Claire recognized the name from the news but couldn't recall much about him. "We've contacted the family," the officer said. "They're on their way." She sat quietly by the roadside, sipping water offered by one of the rescuers. Her body was tired, her hands stung from the cuts, but her mind was still racing. She thought about how strange life could be. How in 1 minute you're driving home thinking about dinner and the next you're crawling through fire to save a stranger's child. It didn't feel real yet. After some time, she saw a sleek black car speed down the highway and stop abruptly near the crash site. A tall man jumped out, his face pale, his movements frantic. He ran straight toward the paramedics, shouting the child's name. Claire stood up slowly. The man fell to his knees when he saw the toddler, clutching the little one tightly and crying in relief. It was a raw, powerful moment. Even the rescuers around them stayed silent, moved by the sight. The man looked up, his eyes red, searching for whoever had saved his child. One of the paramedics pointed toward Claire. He walked over quickly, still holding the child. His voice trembled when he spoke. You saved my son?" Claire nodded softly. She didn't know what to say. The man looked like someone who was used to being in control, yet right now he was completely undone. "I don't even know how to thank you," he said, his voice cracking. "You gave me back my whole world." Claire smiled faintly and said, "You don't have to thank me. I'm just glad he's okay." He stared at her for a moment, as if trying to understand how someone could risk their life for a stranger. Before he could say more, the paramedics told him they had to take the child to the hospital for observation. He nodded, still looking at Claire with disbelief and gratitude. "Please," he said quietly, "come to the hospital. I want to make sure you're both fine." Claire hesitated. "I'll follow in my car," she said. As she drove behind the ambulance, she looked at her hands on the steering wheel, still trembling slightly. The smell of smoke lingered in her hair and her clothes were smudged with dirt and ash. She didn't care. Somewhere deep inside, she felt a mix of exhaustion and peace. When they reached the hospital, Claire watched from a distance as doctors examined the child. The man kept pacing outside the emergency room, running his hands through his hair. After a while, he came to her again, still shaken but calmer now. "You don't know what you've done for me," he said quietly. Claire didn't answer right away. She just looked at the small child through the glass window and said, "He's the one who's strong." "He didn't give up." The man smiled faintly, his eyes softening. "Neither did you." For a brief moment, their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them. Not romance, not yet, but a deep understanding born out of something extraordinary. That night, as Claire finally drove home under the darkening sky, the events of the day replayed in her mind like a movie she couldn't stop watching. The flames, the cries, the weight of the small body in her arms, all of it felt unreal. She didn't know that this single act of courage would change her life forever. She had saved a child, yes, but what would come after was something she could never have imagined. Claire didn't sleep much that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the burning car again, heard the crackling fire, and felt the weight of the little boy in her arms. It had all happened so fast that her mind couldn't fully understand it yet. She had seen many emergencies as a nurse, but this one had felt different. This time she hadn't been inside a hospital, surrounded by medical staff and equipment. She had been completely alone, relying only on courage and instinct. She woke up before sunrise, the sky still pale blue, and sat by the window with a cup of tea. The quiet of her small apartment was almost unsettling after the chaos of the day before. The news on her phone showed photos of the crash site, and though her name wasn't mentioned, she knew it was the same accident. The caption said, "Prominent businessman's son rescued from burning vehicle." Claire felt strange reading it. She didn't see herself as a hero. She had done what anyone should have done if they were there. Just as she was about to leave for her morning shift, her phone buzzed. The hospital receptionist told her someone had called asking to speak with her. "He said it's about the child you helped yesterday," the woman explained. "He left a message and said he'll be visiting today if you're on duty." Claire's first thought was of the father, the man she had met at the crash site. She hadn't even caught his name properly. He had seemed strong yet broken, like someone used to power but suddenly reminded of how fragile life could be. She felt a small nervousness building inside her as she got ready for work. By late morning, the hospital corridors were busy, filled with the usual sounds of nurses' footsteps, beeping machines, and quiet conversations. Claire was restocking supplies when she noticed someone standing near the ward entrance. It was him. He looked different today, calmer, though his eyes still carried the exhaustion of sleepless hours. When he saw her, he walked forward quickly. "I wasn't sure you'd be here," he said softly. "I wanted to thank you again." Claire smiled politely. "You already did yesterday. I'm just happy your son is safe." He paused for a moment as if trying to find the right words. "His name is Ethan," he said finally. "He's doing well now. The doctor said he has a few bruises, but he's strong." His voice softened when he spoke about the boy. Claire nodded. "That's good to hear." He hesitated, then said, "You saved his life. I don't know how to ever repay that. If you hadn't stopped your car." He trailed off, shaking his head. "I don't even want to think about what would have happened." She looked at him gently. "You don't have to repay me, really." But the man wasn't satisfied with that answer. He seemed used to solving problems with action. "At least let me take you to lunch," he said. "It's the least I can do." Claire started to refuse. Hospital rules were strict about personal meetings, but there was something sincere in his voice. So she agreed, saying, "All right, but only for a short while. I have to be back by 3. They met at a small cafe near the hospital. It wasn't a fancy place, just quiet and comfortable. Claire ordered tea. He ordered coffee. For a few moments, neither spoke. Then he smiled faintly and said, "I realize I haven't introduced myself properly. My name's Adrian." "Nice to meet you," Claire replied, "though I wish it had been under better circumstances." Adrian gave a small laugh, though his eyes were still serious. Life rarely gives us good timing. They talked about the accident, how the driver had lost control after another vehicle cut across the road. Adrian told her that he hadn't been in the car because of a last-minute meeting. His driver and son had been on the way to his mother's house. The driver had survived with minor injuries, but the guilt had broken him. Claire listened quietly. She wasn't sure what to say that could ease that kind of pain. After a while, Adrian leaned back and said, "People think having money or influence means you can control everything. But yesterday reminded me how powerless we really are." She nodded. "We all need that reminder sometimes." The conversation drifted to other things: her work at the hospital, his company, and little stories about Ethan. Despite his status, Adrian seemed surprisingly down to earth when he talked about his son. His face softened every time he mentioned him. When it was time to leave, Adrian stood and said, "I know you don't like attention, but the world should know what you did. You didn't just save a child. You saved a part of me." Claire blushed slightly, uncomfortable with praise. "Please don't put me in the news," she said quickly. "I don't want cameras or interviews. I just want life to go back to normal." He nodded slowly. "All right. No reporters, but you'll still be hearing from me." Claire didn't know what that meant, but she smiled politely and said goodbye. Days passed, and she went back to her usual hospital routine. Yet something had changed. Whenever she walked into the pediatric ward and saw small children laughing or crying, she thought of Ethan. Sometimes she even caught herself wondering what he was doing, if he still remembered her face from that smoky moment. A week later, while she was checking charts in the staff room, her supervisor walked in with an envelope. "For you," she said with a curious smile. "Looks like someone's grateful." Inside was a handwritten note. Dear Claire, there are no words that can truly thank you. My mother has been unwell for some time, and I've been looking for someone trustworthy to care for her. I know this is unusual, but I'd be honored if you would consider helping my family privately. The job would come with better pay and flexible hours. Please think about it. Adrian. Attached to the note was a card with his contact number. Claire stared at it for a long time. It was an unexpected offer. She didn't know what to think. The hospital job was steady, but it was exhausting and barely covered her expenses. A private nurse position could change things for her, but working for someone so powerful felt intimidating. That night, she sat at her kitchen table, the letter in front of her. She thought about the day of the accident again, about how fragile life was. Maybe this was life's strange way of giving her a new direction. The next morning, she called the number. Adrian answered almost immediately, his voice warm with relief. You called, he said. I wasn't sure you would. I just wanted to ask more about the job, she said carefully. He explained that his mother, who was in her late 60s, had health issues that required constant attention but preferred to stay at home instead of a hospital. I could hire anyone, he admitted, but I want someone I can trust. After what you did for my son, I trust you completely. His words were sincere, and Claire could hear the hope in them. After thinking for a moment, she said, All right, I'll meet her first. If it feels right, I'll take it. A few days later, Claire visited Adrian's home for the first time. It was nothing like the small apartment she lived in. The house was large but quiet, surrounded by tall trees and a peaceful garden. His mother greeted her kindly, and Claire immediately liked her. She was gentle and had kind eyes that reminded Claire of her own mother. As days turned into weeks, Claire settled into her new role. She spent most of her time caring for Adrian's mother, but she often saw Ethan playing in the garden, running toward her whenever she arrived. He would smile brightly and call her the brave lady, something he had picked up from hearing the adults talk. Adrian was often busy with work, but he always made time to check in. Some evenings he'd join them for tea and talk about simple things: the weather, the flowers his mother loved, or stories from his childhood. Slowly, the house that had once seemed intimidating began to feel warm and familiar. One evening, as Claire was packing up her things to leave, Adrian stopped by the doorway. You've brought peace to this house, he said quietly. My mother laughs more.
Ethan sleeps better, even I.
I feel lighter these days, Claire smiled shyly. Maybe it's just the company. He chuckled. Maybe it's you. There was a pause between them, soft and unspoken. She didn't know how to respond, so she just smiled and said, See you tomorrow. When she stepped outside, the night air felt cool against her face. She looked up at the stars and thought about how strange life could be. Just a few weeks ago, she had been a tired nurse driving home on a lonely road. Now she was part of a family story, one she hadn't planned to join. As she drove home that night, her heart felt light but uncertain. She didn't know where this path would lead, but she sensed that her act of bravery had opened more than just a door. It had changed her destiny. Somewhere deep inside, she knew this was only the beginning of something far bigger than she could imagine. Weeks turned into months, and Claire slowly became a part of the Graves household. She had come as a private nurse for Adrian's mother, but her gentle nature and calm presence made her much more than that. The old house, once quiet and cold, now had warmth again. The sound of laughter echoed in the halls, mostly from Ethan, who had grown attached to Claire in a way that was both sweet and natural. Every morning, when Claire arrived, Ethan would run toward her with his tiny arms stretched out, calling her name with excitement. You came, he'd say, as if afraid she might not. She'd smile and kneel to his level, brushing his hair affectionately before reminding him to eat breakfast. Adrian's mother adored her too. The woman's health had improved since Claire's arrival. She often said, This house hasn't felt alive in years. Claire would laugh softly, insisting she wasn't doing anything special, but deep down, she knew her presence had brought peace to this home that had seen too much silence. Adrian, on the other hand, had changed in quiet but noticeable ways. When Claire first met him, he had been a man of few words, polite, serious, always thinking ahead. But as time passed, she began to see another side of him. He smiled more. He took breaks from work to spend time with his family. Sometimes, after dinner, he would sit with Claire and his mother, listening to stories or simply enjoying the quiet company. One evening, As the sun set behind the garden, Adrian found Claire sitting on the porch, watching Ethan chase butterflies. The golden light made everything look soft and peaceful. He stood beside her for a moment before saying, "He's happier than I've seen him in years." Claire smiled, keeping her eyes on the little boy. Children just need love and time. He's got both now. Adrian turned slightly, studying her face. You've given him more than that. You gave him safety, trust, things I didn't even know he was missing. She looked at him for a brief moment, unsure how to respond. There was sincerity in his voice, gratitude that came from deep within. He's a wonderful child, she said softly. Anyone would love him. Adrian nodded, but his gaze lingered on her for a second longer before he looked away. Days went by in a rhythm that felt almost too good to be real. Claire's mornings began with laughter, her afternoons filled with caring for Adrian's mother, and her evenings spent reading stories to Ethan. Sometimes, she'd catch herself smiling for no reason, realizing how much her life had changed since that day on the highway. But life has a way of testing peace when you least expect it. One morning, as Claire was helping Adrian's mother take her medicine, a maid rushed into the room holding a newspaper. Her face was pale. "Sir is in the news again," she whispered nervously. Claire took the paper, confused. The headline read, "Businessman faces investigation over charity fund misuse." The article claimed that one of Adrian's companies had mishandled money meant for a children's foundation. Her heart sank. She knew Adrian wasn't the kind of man to do such a thing. His eyes always softened when he talked about helping others, especially children. But the world outside didn't see him the way she did. Within hours, reporters crowded outside the mansion's gates. Camera flashes filled the air whenever Adrian's car appeared. Inside, he remained calm on the surface, but Claire could see the worry behind his eyes. His mother was distraught. "People will always try to destroy what they don't understand," she said quietly. That evening, Claire found Adrian in his study, sitting alone, staring at the newspaper on his desk. He didn't notice her at first. When she stepped closer, he finally looked up. "You shouldn't be here," he said in a tired voice. "I don't want you caught in this mess." "I'm already part of this family," she replied gently. "And families don't walk away when things get hard." He looked at her, his eyes filled with something between pain and gratitude. "You're the only one who believes me," he said quietly. "I don't just believe you," she said. "I know you." Over the next few days, the situation worsened. News channels repeated the same accusations, painting Adrian as a greedy businessman. Some of his business partners began to distance themselves. Claire stayed by his mother's side, keeping her calm, but every time she passed Adrian's office, she could hear the weight of silence behind the door. One afternoon, she walked in with a tray of tea and found him staring at an old photo on his desk, one of him and Ethan at a charity event years ago. "Do you know what hurts the most?" he said without looking up. "That everything I built to help others is being turned against me." Claire placed the cup in front of him. "Then tell them the truth. Show them what kind of man you really are." "It's not that simple," he said bitterly. "They want proof, numbers, signatures. And the people who could defend me are too afraid to speak." She hesitated, then said, "Maybe I can help." He looked at her, surprised. "How? Weren't those charity funds connected to the hospital I used to work at?" she asked. "If you really donated what you said you did, there should be records. I know some of the staff there. I can talk to them." Adrian blinked, then leaned back in his chair. For the first time in days, there was a glimmer of hope in his expression. "You'd do that for me?" She smiled softly. "You don't have to ask." The next day, Claire visited the hospital. She spoke to the accounts department and a few old colleagues, carefully gathering what she needed. It took hours of digging, but finally, she found what she was looking for. A set of receipts and letters confirming that Adrian's donations had gone exactly where he said they had. The accusations were false. Someone had twisted the truth for their own gain. When she returned to the mansion that evening, Adrian was in the living room with his lawyers, his face drawn with fatigue. She walked in holding the folder tightly. "I think this will help," she said, handing it to him. He opened it, scanning through the documents. His eyes widened slightly, and then he looked up at her, disbelief written all over his face. "You found this?" She nodded. It took some convincing, but yes. He stood up slowly, walking toward her. Claire, you just saved me. His voice trembled slightly. She smiled. I just found the truth. You did the right thing from the start. That night, Adrian's legal team presented the evidence publicly. Within a day, the accusations collapsed. The same media that had attacked him now praised him for his honesty. He refused interviews, though. He didn't want credit. He only wanted peace back in his home. When it was finally quiet again, he found Claire in the garden, watching Ethan play under the afternoon sun. You didn't just save my son, he said softly as he approached. You saved me twice, she turned to him, surprised. Twice. The first time was when you pulled Ethan out of that car, he said. The second time was when you pulled me out of the fire I couldn't see. She smiled shyly, not sure what to say. He looked at her with warmth in his eyes. Something different from gratitude. Something deeper, though neither spoke it aloud. Life slowly returned to normal after that. The reporters disappeared, the company stabilized, and the mansion was peaceful once again. Adrian's mother often told Claire, you were meant to be here. Some people come into our lives by accident, but some are sent by destiny. Claire didn't know if that was true, but she did know one thing. Her life had changed in ways she could never have planned. She had found purpose, peace, and something close to belonging. One quiet evening after putting Ethan to bed, she stood by the window looking out at the garden. Adrian joined her holding 2 cups of tea. You still don't like being called a hero, do you? He asked with a smile. She shook her head. No. I think heroes are just ordinary people who don't look away. He smiled at that, and they stood in comfortable silence, watching the soft lights of the garden flicker in the distance. For a long time, neither spoke. There was no need to. Some connections don't need words. They just exist, quietly growing stronger with time. That night, as Claire drove home, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Peace, mixed with quiet happiness. She had stepped into a stranger's life by accident, but now she couldn't imagine her world without them. And though she didn't know what the future held, she knew one thing for certain. What had started as a single moment of courage on a smoky road had become the beginning of something far more beautiful than she had ever expected. A week after the rescue, her life still didn't feel normal. Every time she stepped outside, someone recognized her. People at the grocery store smiled, whispered, or came up to thank her. It was kind, but also overwhelming. She didn't see herself as a hero. She had just done what any person should do. She saved a child because she could. Her hands were still bandaged, and every time she looked at them, she remembered the heat, the smoke, the child's frightened face. Nights were the hardest. She often woke up from dreams where she was running through fire again. Sometimes she would sit up in bed, her heart racing, trying to convince herself that everyone was safe now. One morning, she was sipping tea by her window when she noticed a black car slowly stop in front of her building. A tall man stepped out wearing a dark suit. He didn't look like a reporter. He looked calm but serious. For a moment, she thought he might be from the hospital, but when he walked toward her door, her stomach tightened. When she opened the door, she saw a familiar face. It was the man whose child she had rescued. She had seen him briefly at the hospital that night, though everything had been a blur. Now seeing him clearly, she noticed how composed he seemed, but his eyes looked tired, as if he hadn't slept properly in days. I hope I'm not disturbing you, he said in a quiet, deep voice. She shook her head and invited him in. He looked around her small apartment, simple, clean, with a few plants near the window and a soft blanket draped over the couch. He smiled faintly, maybe because it was so different from his world. I wanted to thank you again, he said. I don't think words will ever be enough. She smiled, unsure what to say. You already did that night, she replied. Your son is safe. That's all that matters. He nodded, his jaw tightening slightly. It's strange, he said, looking down. You saved my whole world in those few minutes. And I don't even know you. She looked at him, unsure how to respond. She wasn't used to praise, especially not from someone so powerful. He noticed her hesitation and smiled softly. You don't like attention, do you? She laughed quietly. Not really. I prefer quiet things, work, home, peace. He nodded again as if he understood completely. Then he paused, thinking carefully about his next words. I know this might sound unusual, he said, but I'd like to make you an offer. She frowned slightly. An offer? He leaned forward. My mother has been unwell for a while. We've had many nurses, but none seem to stay. They either find the work too demanding or they're only there for the pay. You're different. You have courage, calmness, and heart. I want to offer you a position as her private nurse. She blinked, surprised. That was not what she had expected. Your mother? She asked. Yes, he said. She's kind but fragile. She needs someone patient, someone who cares. I can tell you're that kind of person. She hesitated. It sounded like an incredible opportunity. Better pay, stability, a chance to help someone. But she wasn't sure about stepping into his world. He was a man whose face appeared in magazines, whose name carried weight in business. She was just a nurse from a small apartment in the city. I appreciate it, she said slowly, but I'm not sure if I'd fit in. He smiled gently. You already fit into my family's life more than you realize, he said, his voice softening. My son asks for you every night. He calls you the fire angel. He still talks about how you carried him out. That touched her heart in a way she didn't expect. She looked down, smiling faintly. He's a sweet boy, she said, braver than most adults I know. Then say yes, he said kindly. At least come meet my mother before you decide. After a long pause, she agreed. All right, she said. I'll meet her. A few days later, she found herself standing in front of a large iron gate that opened into a quiet, beautiful estate outside the city. The place was surrounded by trees, and the house looked elegant but peaceful. A caretaker guided her inside. The air smelled of flowers and old books. It wasn't like the busy, cold world she had imagined. It felt calm, lived in, full of memories. His mother was sitting by the window, wrapped in a shawl, reading. When she looked up, her eyes were kind and warm. So you're the one who saved my grandson, she said with a smile. I just did what anyone would do, she said softly. The older woman chuckled. Not everyone would. I've read about it. You have a brave heart. They spoke for a while. About life, about kindness, about small things that made days brighter. By the end of that conversation, the woman reached out and held her hand. I would be honored if you worked here, she said. She looked at her, feeling something she hadn't in a while. Belonging. And just like that, she said yes. Her days changed after that. She started working in the big house, taking care of the older woman, who treated her like family. The child Ethan often came running to her room with his toys, his laughter filling the halls. Slowly, the house began to feel less like someone else's world, and more like a shared space filled with warmth and purpose. The man she had rescued the child for, Alexander, was always busy, but he often stopped to check on his mother. At first, their interactions were formal. He was polite, distant, used to being in control. But over time, she noticed something. He relaxed when she spoke to his mother, or when Ethan laughed around her. One evening, while they were all in the garden, the boy tugged her hand and asked her to tell a story. She began telling a simple story about courage, and she noticed Alexander standing nearby, listening quietly. There was a softness in his eyes she hadn't seen before. After that day, things between them began to shift. He started joining them for evening tea. Sometimes they spoke about his work, sometimes about life. She learned that he had lost his wife in an accident years ago, and since then he had buried himself in work. His mother had been his only support and his son his only light. After that day, he said once, looking at her, when I saw you run into that fire, I realized something. I've spent years building walls around myself, and you just walked through them. She didn't know what to say. She just smiled and looked away. Weeks turned into months. Her life became peaceful again, but in a very different way. She still lived simply, still liked quiet mornings and hot tea, but now there was laughter in her days. Stories shared and small, gentle moments that felt like healing. One evening, his mother called her into her room. She was sitting in her chair holding an old photo album. You've brought life back into this house, she said softly. Alexander smiles again. Ethan sleeps without crying. You have a gift, dear. Don't ever doubt that, she smiled, feeling shy. I'm just doing my job, she said. The older woman shook her head. No, you're doing more than that. You're giving this family something they lost. Peace. That night, as she walked back to her room, she thought about how life had turned out. A few months ago, she was just a tired nurse driving home from work. Now she was part of a story that had changed many lives, and including her own. Still, she stayed humble. She didn't think about fame or reward. She only thought about doing what felt right, one day at a time. One night after she had tucked Ethan into bed, she found Alexander standing by the balcony, looking out at the city lights. He turned as she walked closer. "Do you ever think about that day?" he asked quietly. "Every day," she said honestly, "but not for the fire. For what came after." He smiled faintly. "You changed everything, you know. Not just for me, but for my family." She looked at him, the night air gentle around them. "Sometimes," she said softly, "we're put in the right place at the right time. Not just to save someone else, but to find something we've lost ourselves." He looked at her for a long moment, his eyes calm but full of meaning. "Maybe that's true," he said. There was silence then, but it wasn't empty. It was the kind of silence that feels peaceful, like the end of a storm. In that moment, she realized something. What had started as a rescue on a burning road had become something much deeper, a reminder that sometimes the people we save end up saving us too. Months passed, and her life inside the big house had become something peaceful and steady. Every morning began with sunlight spilling through the curtains, the sound of birds outside, and little Ethan's laughter echoing down the hallway. The once distant and cold mansion now felt alive again. The staff smiled more. The air felt lighter. It was as if a quiet joy had returned, and she was part of that change. She had grown close to everyone in the family. The older woman she cared for treated her like a daughter now. They would often sit together near the window, talking about the garden or the weather or old memories. Sometimes she caught herself smiling for no reason, just because life finally felt calm and kind again. Alexander, once the stern, unreadable man who kept his world locked away, had also changed. He smiled more often, laughed with his son, and even joined them for simple dinners. He no longer looked like a man burdened by success and expectations. Instead, he looked like someone learning to breathe again. But life has its way of testing peace just when everything feels settled. One evening, while she was helping the older woman with her medicine, she noticed Alexander pacing in the hallway, phone pressed to his ear. His voice was low but tense. After the call ended, he stood still for a long time, staring at the floor. She stepped out quietly and asked, "Is everything all right?" He looked up, startled, then gave a faint smile that didn't reach his eyes. "It's complicated," he said. "Something's happening with my company. There's been a mistake, or at least that's what they're calling it." She frowned. "What kind of mistake?" he sighed. "They're saying funds were misused, that I approved transactions I never even knew about. The media found out before I did. Tomorrow it'll be everywhere." Her heart sank. She had seen how hard he worked, how honest he was. "He didn't deserve this, can't you explain it?" she asked softly. He shook his head. "People don't listen to explanations. They listen to headlines." That night, the quiet house felt heavy. Even little Ethan sensed the tension and stayed close to her side. She tried to keep him distracted with stories, but his big, curious eyes kept glancing toward his father, who sat in silence by the fireplace, lost in thought. By morning, it was everywhere, news channels, newspapers, online articles. They called him the businessman under investigation, twisting his image into something cold and greedy. They forgot about the man who donated to orphanages, who helped rebuild schools, who stayed awake nights making sure his employees didn't lose their jobs. They only cared about the scandal. Reporters waited outside the gates and cars followed them on the road. She could see the stress wearing on him, though he tried to hide it. His mother worried constantly. Ethan began waking up at night, afraid his father would be taken away. Through it all, she stayed. She made sure meals were eaten, medicine taken, and words of kindness spoken when silence felt too heavy. One evening, she found Alexander sitting in his study, surrounded by papers. His jacket was off, his tie loose, and his eyes looked tired. "You should rest," she said gently. He gave a small laugh. "Rest when the world thinks I'm a criminal?" She sat across from him. "You know the truth. That's what matters." He looked at her for a long moment. "I wish the world worked that way," he said quietly. But truth doesn't always shout loud enough. There was something in his voice that made her heart ache. He had faced loss before, but this felt different. This was the kind of hurt that comes from being misunderstood by the very people you tried to do right by. Then she remembered something. The night of the fire, the rescue, she had seen one of his men there earlier. He was the same man now being mentioned in the reports as a source in the case. She remembered overhearing him talking about some paperwork, something about donations and company funds. It hadn't made sense then, but now it did. She told Alexander what she remembered, every detail. His eyes widened as she spoke. Then, without another word, he pulled out an old folder from the bottom drawer of his desk. Inside were receipts, letters, and handwritten notes proving that the transactions in question were not for personal gain, but for rebuilding. Homes in a poor neighborhood after a flood. He stared at the papers like someone seeing sunlight after weeks of darkness. These could clear my name, he said quietly. She nodded. Then show them. But he hesitated. The media won't listen to me anymore. They'll call it fabricated. She looked at him steady and calm. Then let me tell the story. He frowned. You? Yes, she said softly. People believe in real people. Not headlines, not corporate words, just truth told from the heart. The next day, she went with him to a small community press event. Cameras clicked as soon as they arrived, questions flying like arrows. But when she stepped forward and spoke, the noise faded. She told them everything. How she had met him, how she had seen his kindness, how his so-called missing funds had gone into building shelters for families who had lost everything. She spoke simply, without big words or rehearsed lines, just truth. And people listened. Within days, the story changed. Journalists started digging into the details, and soon enough the truth came out. The man who had framed him confessed under pressure. The scandal began to dissolve. When Alexander returned home after the final hearing, the air felt lighter. Reporters were gone. Headlines softened, and for the first time in weeks, he smiled without force. That evening, the family gathered for dinner. The house felt warm again, filled with laughter and peace. His mother reached across the table and held her hand. You didn't just save a life, she said softly. You saved our name, our family. She felt her eyes sting, but she smiled, brushing it off. I just told the truth, she said. Later that night, when the house was quiet and the stars were bright above the garden, she walked outside for some air. The night breeze felt calm, carrying the scent of blooming flowers. She stood there for a while, lost in thought, when she heard footsteps behind her. Alexander stood there, hands in his pockets, watching her. For a long moment, neither spoke. You always show up when everything's falling apart, he said quietly. She smiled faintly. Maybe I just happened to be in the wrong place at the right time. He stepped closer. No, he said softly. You were exactly where we needed you to be. They stood there side by side, not saying much. The quiet between them wasn't awkward anymore. It was peaceful, filled with the kind of understanding words couldn't explain. He looked at her then, really looked as if seeing her for the first time, not as the nurse, not as the woman who ran into a fire, but as someone who had become part of his life in a way he hadn't expected. I used to believe power was everything, he said after a while, but now I know it means nothing without the people who make life worth living. She turned to him, her eyes warm. Power fades, but kindness stays, she said. He smiled at that, and for the first time she saw no trace of the cold businessman people talked about, just a man who had been broken and rebuilt by love, courage, and truth. As days passed, things returned to normal again, though normal meant something new now. The company recovered, the family grew closer, and she remained a part of it all. Not as an employee anymore, but as someone who had found a home there. Sometimes she would sit in the garden with Ethan watching him play. He'd run up to her giggling and say, "You're still my fire angel," and she'd laugh every time. One afternoon, as they all sat together having tea, Alexander's mother looked around the table at her son, her grandson, and the woman who had brought them all together and said, "Do you know what's truly unbelievable?" They looked at her curiously. "That one moment on a burning road could lead to this," she said softly, her eyes full of gratitude. Sometimes miracles start in the most frightening places. They all fell silent, letting her words sink in. That night, as the sun set beyond the trees, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, she stood by the window again, thinking about everything that had happened. From the fire to the fear, from chaos to peace, it all felt like a story too strange to be real. Yet it was. She had saved a child once, but in doing so, she had found a family. And that was the most unbelievable part of all.